We need to get started. I just noticed that we're like already at 10 of, and I have trouble ending on time as it is. So, no, that's okay. Let's open with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into Judges chapter 6, starting at verse 33. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we can come together, look at your word, learn from your word, apply it to our lives. I pray for those down the hall who are working with the kids and with the teens that you'd give them clarity of mind and that your word would go forth. I pray for those involved with the morning service and the communion fellowship and pastor as he brings the message, that you would bless that. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so there is a half-sheet handout at the back if you wanted that. The top of it is just kind of a review of the overall structure of the Gideon narrative, broken into 4 parts. The first part that we looked at last week being God calling and commissioning Gideon to be the next deliverer for Israel. Today we're going to be getting into the next section of that, which is going to be God giving Gideon victory. And we'll be in Judges chapter 6, starting at verse 33, and going through the Judges chapter 7. So God has called and commissioned Gideon as the next judge. And in verse 33, we have, "Then all the Midianites and Amalekites, the people of the east, gathered together, and they crossed over and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and then he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him, and he sent messages throughout all Manasseh, who also gathered behind him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them." So in this first section here, chapter 6, verses 33 to 35, we see the Amalekites, the Midianites, and those from the east who have joined together with the Midianites as this coalition against the Israelites, who've been oppressing the Israelites, basically waiting until harvest is ready, coming through, stealing and ravaging all of Israel's harvest. Israel is hiding in dens and caves of fear. Food is in short supply. Last week we saw Gideon hiding in a wine press to thresh wheat so that the Midianites wouldn't steal that wheat from him. And here we have all of these individuals from Midianites and Amalekites coming into the Jezreel Valley, which is the same area that we saw where Deborah and Barak took on General Sisera. It is an area in Israel that is this flat valley that is very good farmland and is surrounded by these mountains. And it's strategically located in the mountains where it's this crossroad. And so because of that, there have been many important battles throughout history that have occurred there at this kind of crossroads. It's the same place we talked about where Megiddo is located, the mountain of Megiddo. And in Greek, that would be Armageddon. So Armageddon is the location of the final battle at this same crossroad that here the Midianites, the Amalekites are setting up camp. And then Gideon is calling first from his own family, the Abiezrites. That would have been his family clan from the tribe of Manasseh. He then extends the call to the tribe of Manasseh itself, which has their territory is very close to the Jezreel Valley there. And then the other tribes of Israel who are very close geographically to the Jezreel Valley, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. And all of them respond and send soldiers and fighting men. It's kind of interesting here, when we looked at in chapter 5, the Song of Deborah, some of the tribes of Israel were commended for participating and responding in the battles against General Sisera and King Jabin. Others were condemned for not participating. Asher was one that didn't participate. Here we see Asher is participating. Asher is responding to that call. Asher has responded correctly from being chastised by God for not participating, and that they are front and center participating now. So we have the Midianites setting up their camp, and Gideon now, though he's been hesitant, is calling an army to him. Well, we see in verse 36 that Gideon is still a bit fearful and hesitant. So Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you've said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece together, he wrung the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. And then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry in the fleece, but on all of the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night. It was dry in the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. So Gideon, even though God came to him with an angel and told him that he was going to give the Midianites into his hand, even though God gave him the sign of the angel bringing fire down on the bread and the goat and the meal that Gideon had prepared, Gideon is still hesitant, he's still scared, and asks for 2 more tests. Now, often in Near Eastern divination, before a battle, individuals would go to the soothsayer, the diviner, and they would do 2 tests to verify that they really should go to war. So this 2 test is really kind of a Canaanite pagan culture that Gideon has adopted here and is applying to God. In Deuteronomy 6:16, let's turn there quickly. Deuteronomy 6:16. God tells the Israelites, "You shall not tempt the Lord your God." It's very likely that Gideon knew this command, especially since when he brings up his second test in verse 39, Gideon says, "Do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test." Gideon's coming right out and saying that he's testing God. He's also recognizing that he probably shouldn't be doing this, but he does it anyways. It's unlikely that if he thought that this was completely okay and natural, that he would have prefaced it with, "God, don't be angry with me for what I'm about to do, because I know it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyways." Judges 2, verse 22. Sorry, I'm going to do a little bit of flipping here today. Let's see, where are we? Judges 2:22. "So that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not." So this is God speaking due to Israelites' unfaithfulness, due to them absorbing Canaanite culture, due to them turning after the gods of Canaan. He is saying that through the nations that are left, he will test Israel. In the book of Judges, it is God who is testing Israel. Gideon is stepping out of that, and he is now trying to test God. That's not where he should be. Verse 36, Gideon says to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you've said, I shall put a fleece of wool. If there's dew on the fleece and it's dry on the ground, then I will know that you will save Israel. Stop and think about what Gideon is really saying to God right here. He's saying to God, you have told me that you will deliver the Midianites into my hand. But I will only know you are telling the truth if you do this test that I'm setting before you. And then if I do this test, I will know that God Almighty, you are not lying to me. Along with testing God here, Gideon is questioning God's honesty. That's not a place that we should be as believers. And he says, if you do this, God, I will know. And then he proceeds, after God does that, to say, one more time. I see that you did that. I said I'd know, but you know what? I really don't. So could you do it again? But this time, fleece dry, ground wet. We're going to switch it around a little bit. We're going to make it trickier this time. God does that. So first we see again Gideon's human hesitancy, his weakness, at being handed what is admittedly a very difficult task. We see him falling into this practice that he shouldn't be doing as far as it patterning the practice of the divination of the pagan cultures that he shouldn't be doing. You see him questioning God. You see him breaking a command where God says, don't. You shouldn't be testing me, back from Deuteronomy. Don't test or tempt God. But that's really not the important part in this passage. The important part is God's response. Despite Gideon's hesitancy, his fear, his wrong actions, God provides him those two signs. Because God is patient with us. Even when we are weak, even when we are not doing what we're supposed to be doing, God is patient with us, even though he doesn't have to be. He's patient with our actions. He was very patient with Gideon here. Not only was he patient, but he was very gracious in giving Gideon these signs that he knew Gideon desperately needed because of Gideon's weakness. And God was gracious in, again, giving him what Gideon really didn't deserve. He had been already told this and should be, at this point, doing it. So we see God's patience, God's graciousness here. It's also possible that Gideon was doing this to stall a little bit of time. We talked about last week how it's quite possible that when he went and prepared the bread and the goat offering, that he was kind of stalling, hoping maybe the angel wouldn't be there when he got back after spending all of this time baking 20 pounds worth of bread and dressing and killing a goat and preparing a goat and all of that. But God was patient and the angel waited for him. He waited for Gideon to get to the point where he had brought his offering there. Could be that Gideon was hoping that with these two tasks, God would change his mind and say, you know what, you're right, Gideon. You're not the guy. We're going to pick somebody else here. But God doesn't. Because God is calling Gideon. God is working with Gideon. Gideon is the guy, so to speak, here, even though Gideon doesn't quite realize it. So, moving on to chapter 7, verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. So they're in the Jezreel Valley area. There's a spring and a cave at Harod here, kind of in this mountainous area that they're in. They're hiding in the mountains at this spring. Need water supply? Good place to be. It's also interesting that the word Harod here means trembling. They're gathering at the spring of trembling. It's kind of appropriate given Gideon's fear and hesitancy that he calls the army together and their staging spot is the well of trembling, basically. Now, by the end of this, God is going to switch things, and Gideon will no longer be the one who's trembling. it will be the Midianites who are trembling. So a little bit of irony here as far as it starts with Gideon's fear and them at this spring or well with the innumerable numbers of the Midianites and Amalekites down in the valley below them. Gideon's name, in the previous chapter we saw that when he tore down his father's altar to Baal, he was then given the name Jerubbaal, the one who contends or fights with Baal. Recently, around 2019 or so, in an archaeological dig in Israel, some fragments of a pottery jar were found with the inscription of the name Jerubbaal on it. This name, Jerubbaal, the only place it has appeared prior to there is in the Bible. There's no other place where that name appears. And in Judges is the only place that name appears. Until a few years ago, some archaeologists found pottery shards with an inscription on it of Jerubbaal's name. Now, they don't know for sure whether it's Gideon's or somebody else who had the same name. But it does date from the era of Judges, the time period of Judges, and it does show that this name was being used by at least someone during that time period. So it's not proof that this had to do with Gideon, but it's certainly confirmation that in that time period there's archaeological evidence that there was a Jerubbaal who existed and was an individual who was important enough that he got his name on a piece of pottery. And it's not like they're finding archaeological digs from that time period, large numbers of pottery shards with people's names on them. It's very rare to find pottery shards with people's names on them. And it happens that this one is the name of one of the judges. So potentially some archaeological evidence that is at least consistent with the biblical narrative, even if it doesn't outright prove it. So, verse 2, and the Lord said to Gideon, "The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself." So this is great. Huge number of Midianites and Amalekites. Gideon is finally on board and calling the tribe of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali to him. He's gathered this large number of soldiers. They're encamped as this spring of Herod. Gideon is now, with the 2 tasks with the fleece, is a little bit more on board that God is really going to do this. And the first thing God does when he meets with him in his camp is like, "You've got too many people, Gideon. This is never going to work." Imagine you're the military leader. You're Gideon. And God comes to you and says, "Yeah, no, there's too many people here. You got to get rid of some of this. Your army's too big." Is that going to build confidence or more fear? He's already been questioning God, and now God's military plan is you've got too many. And on top of that, it's estimated, based on a verse we'll run into next week, that there was about 135,000 in the Midianite Amalekite army. And the numbers we're going to see that Gideon has rounded up is about 32,000. They're already outnumbered 4-1, and God's like, "No, we don't need this many." And the reason for that is because God is going to bring the victory, and God wants to make it very clear, both to the Midianites and to Gideon and to the Israelites and to anyone who's reading the book of Judges, that this battle is God's, not Gideon's. God has enlisted Gideon to be the human agent who's leading this, but it's not because Gideon's army is so strong. So, verse 3, "Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead." And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So already Gideon has just lost 2/3 of his army because they're afraid. I read this, kind of half expecting that when God tells Gideon to proclaim to the people, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart, that Gideon be like, yeah, I'm out of here. He's got his out. He's just been told to tell the army, whoever's afraid can go home, and Gideon's like, I'm leading the charge. But he doesn't. And I suspect that God wouldn't have allowed him to, because even though God is saying those who are afraid can go home, Gideon's not included in this. He's already been told by God that it's by his hand and his deliverance that God will deliver the people of Israel. He's not getting an out here. And this is actually interesting, because this of sending home the fearful is consistent with what God laid down in Deuteronomy, chapter 20, verse 8. We're not going to turn there, but Deuteronomy 20, verse 8, God is going through the reasons why an Israelite could be excused from military service. One was if he'd just been married. His focus should be on establishing his house and his family, and an individual who was just married had a 1-year grace period that they did not need to have military service, and they should have no penalty brought against them. Another was if they were building a house, and generally if an individual was building a house, it probably meant they were betrothed and getting ready to be married, so it was a similar type of thing. And then the third was, if a soldier's afraid, he's allowed to go home without any penalty, so he doesn't dishearten the rest and drop morale of the rest of them. So here what we see is Gideon just tested God twice with a fleece, and his testing was contrary to the law in Deuteronomy. God now has come and said, Gideon, you have too many soldiers, and God now applies 2 tests to Gideon's army to mirror what Gideon just did. But now, when God applies these tests, they're consistent with the book of Deuteronomy. They're consistent with the law. So the first test is, if you're fearful, go home. Which is kind of ironic, because Gideon was testing God incorrectly twice because he was fearful. God comes to Gideon and says, you've got too many people. I'm going to apply 2 tests. And the first one is, if you're fearful, go home. And 22,000 of the army goes home. Now here it mentions, depart at once from Mount Gilead. Some have said, well, this is an inconsistency in the book of Judges. This is proof that Judges is just this fictional history. Because Mount Gilead is east of the Jordan River. The Jezreel Valley is west of the Jordan River. Mount Gilead is well south of the Jezreel Valley area. But there is, in the mountains close to where the likely location of the spring of Harod is a rock formation that's about 8 meters by 10 meters. It's a large rock formation. And that large rock formation is referred to as a Gilead. So it's very likely the Gilead that is being referred to here is not the Mount Gilead that's on maps, but it is a rock formation that they likely were using as kind of this meeting area for Gideon and his leaders of the companies for these individuals. So this Gilead is likely not the Mount Gilead in the south. So verse 4, but the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. We got rid of 22,000, you've got 10,000 left, the army's 135,000, your army's still too big. So bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And notice, when Gideon tested God the second time, he's like, don't be angry with me if I do this test. God's like, I'm going to test you here. I'm going to test your army here. But again, here, God is the one who should be doing the testing. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, the same shall go with you, and whomever I shall say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go with you. God is making it very clear to Gideon with this repetition here that God is the one calling the shots. God is the one that is in command here. And the one who's going to do the testing, if any testing is going to be done. So God is reducing Gideon's army with two tests here. So verse 5. So Gideon brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set him apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all of the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hands. Let the other people go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. So God sets his test, have the men drink, and divide them by how they drink. Those who scoop the water and then lap it out of their hand, and those who kneel down and drink the water directly. And it's broken into two groups, one of 300 and one of 9,700. Now I suspect with this test, you notice at the outset, God has Gideon divide them, but he doesn't say which group he's going to pick. I think the group that God was going to pick was always going to be the smaller group. It didn't matter how they drank. Whatever the smaller number was, that was the number God was picking, because the point of this was reducing the numbers down. 135,000. So we've gone from Gideon having an army of 32,000 against 135,000. God saying that's too many, dropping it down to 10,000, and now dropping it down to 300. And that's a sufficiently small number that God has decided that this victory, 300 versus 135,000, no matter how big these dudes are, it's going to be very, very clear divine intervention happened here. And that was kind of the point. Now, you've seen some commentators who say, well, this test of the water, drinking the water, those who are kneeling down, they're putting themselves in a vulnerable position as a soldier. Whereas those who scooped it with the water and lapped out of it, they could see their surroundings. So those were the mighty soldiers, and that's why God picked them. Well, first, it's unlikely because the whole point here was not God picking the mighty 300, was reducing Gideon's army. Secondly, those individuals who cupped it in their hand, they're described as lapping like a dog. Lapping like a dog in that culture would not have been a compliment. Dogs were despised. Heathens referred to as dogs. Goliath insults David by saying, "What are you coming out to chase me like a dog with a stick?" So lapping like a dog is probably actually not a compliment of their fighting prowess. It's more likely an insult that these 300 lack the common sense to know how to drink normally. These 300 were probably not the pick of the army. These 300 were probably the ones who weren't afraid because they really didn't understand what they were getting into. And they're the ones who, at snack time are struggling with the juice box and getting juice all over their shirt type of people. And keep in mind, Gideon has just expressed his fear to God with the two tasks. And God's response is, I'm just going to leave you with these 300 and everybody else is going to go home. That's what you get, Gideon, for questioning God. God is showing Gideon that it's not about his army, it's not about his strength, it's all about what God is going to do. Now, which interpretation is correct? Whether it is the boldest soldiers or the least fit soldiers, or was it just completely random? I tend to think that lapping like a dog here is an indication that these individuals were not the ones who are ready to fight. But they don't need to be, we're going to turn out, because they don't need to pick up a weapon. In fact, they aren't armed with a weapon when God arms them. So, verse 9. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand." So after God sends most of the army, leaves Gideon with 300, Gideon does not even get time to train with them. God's like, tonight's the night. Take your 300 soldiers you've got left, and you're going to go up with them. Verse 10. But if you are afraid to go down, and probably that would be better read, but since you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. So notice, Gideon asked God for 2 signs, and God did graciously provide those. But God is giving one more measure of grace here. He knows Gideon is still scared. He knows that probably now Gideon is even more scared now that he only has an army of 300 and they have to attack tonight. God gives him a 3rd level of comfort. Gideon didn't ask for this at this point. I think he's realized that he was out of line. But God in his graciousness and his patience recognized Gideon is scared, and God says, before you go down, take your servant, and I'm going to show you something that will bolster your courage, that will bolster your confidence. So then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. I'd never really noticed this before, but last night when I was reviewing this, I hit that and I was like, man, God just told Gideon that he is going to give him an additional sign from what he hears, that he'll be strengthened. He sends Gideon by himself with a servant down to the Midianite camp, and the first thing that Gideon is confronted with is an innumerable host of soldiers and camels, more innumerable than the sands on the seashore and the locusts. What has Gideon got to be thinking? He's got to be thinking, wait, this is not helping. When I couldn't see them, I was scared. Now it's like, oh, this is really bad. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. And he said, I've had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it, so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. So there's this dream. This is throughout the Bible's dreams having significance. Here the dream is a Midianite individual who's standing guard has had this dream, and he shares it with his guard companion there. It's kind of an odd dream. We have this loaf of barley knocks into a Midian tent. What does this mean? First, barley is an inferior grain. Some think that, well, that's showing that Israel right here in Gideon had a very inferior army, but yet that army was going to be victorious. The word tumbled, a loaf of barley bread tumbled, that word is also used at the Garden of Eden to describe the sword that the angel had to keep people out after Adam and Eve sinned. That word is also used to describe the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So this loaf of barley bread is being described as having some pretty substantial power. If it's using the same wording as what was used for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and also the power of the angel who was guarding the Garden of Eden when Eve and Adam were first sent out from it. So verse 14, then his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. Now first, you got to wonder. You've got two guards talking. One of them's like, I had this weird dream last night. This barley loaf came down and destroyed one of the tents. And the other one's like, oh, of course. I know what this means. There's nothing else that this could be except for Gideon having victory over us because God has handed us over to them, basically. Who comes up with that sort of interpretation? Another mark here that God is at work. The only way that somebody would come up with that interpretation and be that confident with that interpretation is both the dream and the interpretation were of God. And they were twofold. One, they were a warning to the Midianites. You are going to fall to an inferior army. And secondly, it was an encouragement to Gideon that God was going to use his inferior army to defeat the Midianites. Now, it's interesting here that the Midianite who interprets a dream basically says, into his hand, into Gideon's hand, God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. We've heard that before. That's what God has been repeatedly telling Gideon. And it's kind of ironic here that it's when a Midianite says it that Gideon responds as he does in verse 15. And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of this dream and its interpretation that he worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. This is like the first time that Gideon is really, really confident. We kind of flip back for a moment. Chapter 6, verse 12. Chapter 6, verse 12. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him, and that be Gideon, and said to him, The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. Verse 14. Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? Verse 16. And the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. Let's see, verse 37 is where we talked about Gideon is telling God, I know you've said that I will save Israel, but I will only know it if you give me this sign with this fleece. And he does it twice. That's at least 5 times where God has directly told Gideon what to do, what was going to happen. A total of 5 times. And it's the 6th time when a Midianite says it that Gideon's like, yes, I can believe God. Now, on the one hand, it shows, again, God's patience with providing just over and over until Gideon gets it. And God does the same thing with us because, we pretty much do the same things that Gideon does in terms of being hesitant, fearful, etc. at some point in our lives. But it's also somewhat sad that here Gideon almost puts more stock in this interpretation of a dream and a Midianite interpreting the dream than God directly telling him. And that's something we have to be careful about. Sometimes we see things in the Bible that we know God is telling us this, but we're hesitant and scared, so we keep looking for other confirmations other than what we clearly know God has told us. Thankfully, when we do that, God is patient with us. But it would probably be better if God didn't need to have that level of patience with us. So Gideon now goes back to camp, goes to his 300 men, Arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of the Midianites into your hand. And we're back, chapter 7, verse 16 now. He divided the 300 into 3 companies. He put a trumpet into every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. So in one hand, they have a ram's horn trumpet. The other, they have a torch and a pitcher that's covering it so the torch will smolder, but the light can't be seen. They're not being armed with swords, which, if the interpretation is correct, that those who lapped weren't the best soldiers, might be a good thing. That they're not given sharp, pointy things to run around with in the dark. Either way here, God is now taking this woefully, ridiculously small army and outfitting them not with weapons, but with noisy things and shiny things to call attention to their location. That's really kind of a ridiculous battle plan. Some may say, oh, Gideon's battle plan was brilliant. Not really, except for the fact that his battle plan really was hinged on God doing all the work. And then it makes sense. So he said to them, look at me and do likewise. Watch, and when I come to the edge of camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all are with me, when you also blow the trumpets on every side, the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So first, this is good. Gideon is taking leadership. He's telling them what to do. They're going to go, and he ends with the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, which mostly sounds good, but there's a problem. It really should be the sword of the Lord, and that's it. Now that Gideon is starting to be on board with this leadership role, he's starting to want the reward of leadership. He wants the honor. This is not just for the Lord, this is for the Lord and Gideon. We're not going to turn there, but contrast that, if you want to write this down. 1 Samuel 17, verses 45 to 47. 1 Samuel 17, 45 to 47. David, going up against Goliath, says, for the battle is the Lord's. He doesn't add, for the battle is the Lord's and David's. For the battle is the Lord's. And in that passage, he recognized that the God is delivering Goliath and the Philistines into his hand and into the Israelites' hand. Here, Gideon is slipping into a pagan practice. There are archaeological inscriptions from the Philistines, such as commemorating battles, that have the following: for Baal and for Padi, from the Phoenicians, for Ashtoreth and Pygmalion, and from the Neo-Assyrians, to revere God and king. It's this pattern of the culture surrounding that when they went to war, the battle cry was the deity and the king or general. Gideon is mirroring that. He's absorbed some Canaanite and Philistine culture that is going to come up in the next section where he ends not as well as he begins. So even though he's now on board doing God's will and God is using him, and he is recognizing at least, he's not saying for the sword of Baal and Gideon. He did tear down Baal's, the altar that his father had, but he's using the same form that he shouldn't be using. And that is the deity and him, as opposed to exclusivity to God. So then we have, just going to read through the battle quickly with a lot of comments since we're almost out of time. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outposts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, at 10 o'clock at night, just as they had posted the watch. So they're doing this at a guard change also. And they blew the trumpets, broke the pitchers that were in the hands. Then the three companies blew the trumpets, broke the pitchers that held the torches in the left hand and the trumpets in the right hand. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And every man stood in his place all around the camp, and the whole army ran and cried out and fled. When the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp, and the army fled to Beth-Acacia toward Zerah and the border of Abel by Tabbath. So middle of the night, suddenly trumpets are blowing, lights are appearing in the mountains surrounding the Midianites. The Midianites are already on edge because of this dream, and they panic. You have these camels that are stampeding. You have soldiers jumping their swords and panicking in the dark, and they're killing each other. Gideon didn't need to bring a sword to this. His 300 men didn't need to bring a sword to this, because it wasn't the sword of the Lord and the sword of Gideon. It was the sword of the Lord, period. Gideon got to be the bystander lighting up the battlefield with his torch and proclaiming God's victory. And the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh and pursued the Midianites. So now those who went home, they see the Midianites are routed. They are now joining into this and chasing down the Midianites and the Amalekites as they are trying to flee back to the east side of the Jordan. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites, seize from them the watering places as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan." Then all the men of Ephraim gathered together, seized the watering places as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan. And they captured 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb, the raven and the wolf. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. So the Midianites and Amalekites are completely routed. The rest of Israel goes to cut them off at the fords of the Jordan. The Ephraimites at the south, and Asher, Naphtali, and Manasseh, the ford more to the north of the Jordan. Because now they're making sure that the Midianites and Amalekites aren't going to cross the Jordan and come back. They're going to end here as far as their oppression. So some key themes that hopefully you picked up on here is, one, God's patience. That's throughout here. God being patient with his believers despite our fear and our weaknesses. God's grace along with that. He's not just patient, but he's gracious with that. And finally, God's deliverance. God provided the total deliverance here with these 300 people with ram's horns and torches over an army of 135,000 who were better supplied and better fed. Let's close with a word of prayer.